Why
The
there's not a
the gates.
larger audience here tonight?
Well, they're going to miss out, aren't they?
They certainly are.
Very warm welcome to everyone. Stories with Soul. This is our final of 4 February readings, our blockbuster February. The 2 rules you've all heard 827 times, but I'll repeat them anyway. At the end, when we have a little discussion, we raise our hands so that it's all conducted in a nice orderly manner. And the other rule which we all remember is that if we have anything that rings, beeps, buzzes, clicks, whirs, pulses audibly, then please switch it off. Life-sustaining medical devices are of course exempt. Very pleased to introduce Paul Black tonight. Paul is, well, first of all, let's go around and introduce ourselves before we introduce Paul. We're going to do a sofas first intro tonight, which means, and then we go back and we do the back. So that worked very well last week. We experimented with back first, sofas second, but we're going to do sofas first.
Okay, Bob Swain.
Madeline Swain.
Francesca Thompson,
Kim Calder.
Steve Michael.
Betty Abbott,
Laura Peterson.
Carlton Bright.
Sharon Coaching.
Willard Brown.
Neil Osborne and
Paul Black. How do you do?
Paul is a very recent joiner of All Souls. He and his wife joined a matter just months ago, I think.
Yeah.
And Paul's wife is called Paula, that's easy to remember.
Paula,
Paula.
I have to tell you that. She's from Argentina and you're in big trouble.
Oh, no.
That's all right. Just don't mention the war.
All right, don't talk. And the new addition to the Black family is Malachi. How old is Malachi?
Malachi's 1 month and 5 days.
Yes.
Yep.
He wanted to be here, but unfortunately
He was a wee bit too fussy.
he was a wee bit too fussy. You might be able to tell from Paul's accent, he's a near neighbour of mine from the other side of the pond. I'm from the west of Scotland, and Paul is from Belfast, so close by. And Paul's chosen for us a story tonight by Frank O'Connor called First Confessions. So I will leave Paul to tell you a little bit about the story and then launch into it.
Excellent, thank you, Neil. First thing, you guys are lost behind the lamp there. Are you? Do you want to move? I would if I were you, and I have to say because I certainly will. But I always find it's easier to listen when I can see. So I want to include you. A couple of words about Frank O'Connor, and then a couple of words about the story, and I'll dive into it. Frank O'Connor was an Irishman, born in Cork in 1903. Grew up in Cork, which is in the very southern end of Ireland. It's the sort of second city to Dublin, and is the sort of the sister city to there. He was born into a very poor family. His father was an alcoholic. He had a very devoted relationship with his mother and a not so great relationship with his father, and as a result of their poverty left school at 14. So continued actually in the school of great Irish writers who was self-taught, like Sean O'Casey, because he went on to teach at Harvard and Stanford, and before that was a director at the Abbey Theatre, which was founded, the National Theatre of Ireland was founded in his lifetime, and was really regarded as one of the preeminent short story writers. He wrote about 150 or more short stories, at least a couple of novels, a couple of autobiographies, really a prolific writer, and some plays. And again, continuing in the great tradition of Irish writers, was banned numerous times in his home country of Ireland for various collections of short stories. So, he died, by the way, he suffered an unfortunate stroke when he was teaching at Stanford University in California in 1961, and returned to Ireland and died in 1966. The year I was born, so what a coincidence. So the story is called First Confession. And a couple of things, I want to just give you a quick glossary of about a half a dozen words that I think will enhance your enjoyment of the story. You're still lost there. The first is porter. Porter is not somebody who carries your bags. It's a form of alcoholic beverage. It's like a thin Guinness, much preferred by the hard drinking men of Ireland, and not usually drunk by ladies. You'll understand the relevance later. A half crown is a coin of substantial value, and in the context here would be perhaps like a $20 or a $50 bill, something that you might want to get your hands on. The term flaking, or in my thick Belfast accent, a flaking is a beating. So if somebody were to give you a flaking or a flaking, it would be a beating or a hiding, such as a father might give a son. A bullseye is like a hard candy, or what we would call a gobstopper. So it's a piece of hard candy that you'd suck on for hours and hours. And just in reference to, I'm a former Catholic, I was raised Catholic. That's part of the reason why I chose this story, and I'm sure we can talk more about that afterwards. But I do just want to sort of briefly touch on confession being one of the sacraments of Catholicism, and your first confession happens, I think, about the age of 8. Maybe somebody can fill me in afterwards, but when I did it, I think it was about the age 8. And you do your first confession, and you do that before your first Holy Communion. So it's one of those rites of passage, like a bar mitzvah or a confirmation. Thank you very much. It's been a while. That, you know, when you're growing up Catholic, that one undergoes. And there is a thing. A bad confession is a confession that where you hold back a sin and you don't tell all your sins, and it's a mortal sin to make a bad confession. And when you're being taught these things at age 8 in school, it's a very serious piece of religious education that's kind of drilled into you. And that kind of, well, just referencing what happens during the story. So, enough of the glossary. Here's First Confession by Frank O'Connor. All the trouble began when my grandfather died, and my grandmother, my father's mother, came to live with us. Relations in the one house are a strain at the best of times, but to make matters worse, my grandmother was a real old country woman and quite unsuited to life in the town. She had a fat, wrinkled old face, and to mother's great indignation, went round the house in bare feet. The boots had her crippled, she said. For dinner, she had a jug of porter and a pot of potatoes with, sometimes, a bit of salt fish. And she poured out the potatoes on the table and ate them slowly with great relish, using her fingers by way of a fork. Now, girls are supposed to be fastidious, but I was the one who suffered most from this. Nora, my sister, just sucked up to the old woman for the penny she got every Friday out of the old age pension. A thing I could not do. I was too honest. That was my trouble. And when I was playing with Bill O'Connell, the Sergeant Major's son, and saw my grandmother steering up the path with the jug of porter sticking out from beneath her shawl, I was mortified. I made excuses not to let him come into the house, because I could never be sure what she would be up to when we went in. When Mother was at work and my grandmother made the dinner, I wouldn't touch it. Nora once tried to make me, but I hid under the table from her and took the bread knife with me for protection. Nora let on to be very indignant. She wasn't, of course, but she knew Mother saw through her, so she sided with Gran. And she came after me. I lashed at her with the bread knife, and after that she left me alone. I stayed there till Mother came in from work and made my dinner. But when Father came in later, Nora said in a shocked voice, "Oh, Dada, do you know what Jackie did at dinner time?" Then, of course, it all came out. Father gave me a flaking, Mother interfered, and for days after that he didn't speak to me and Mother barely spoke to Nora. And all because of that old woman. God knows, I was heart-scalded. Then, to crown my misfortunes, I had to make my first confession and communion. It was an old woman called Ryan who prepared us for these. She was about the one age with Gran. She was well-to-do, lived in a big house on Montnot, wore a black cloak and bonnet and came every day to school at 3 o'clock when we should have been going home, and talked to us of hell. She may have mentioned the other place as well, but that could only have been by accident, for hell had the first place in her heart. She lit a candle, took out a new half-crown, and offered it to the first boy who would hold one finger, only one finger, in the flame for 5 minutes by the school clock. Now, being very ambitious, I was tempted to volunteer, but I thought it might look greedy. Then she asked, were we afraid of holding one finger, only one finger, in a little candle flame for 5 minutes, and not be afraid of burning all over in roasting hot furnaces for all eternity? All eternity! Just think of that! A whole lifetime goes by and it's nothing, not even a drop in the ocean of your sufferings. The woman was really interesting about hell. But my attention was all fixed on the half-crown. At the end of the lesson, she put it back in her purse. It was a great disappointment. A religious woman like that, you wouldn't think she'd bother about a thing like a half-crown. Another day, she said, she knew a priest who woke one night to find a fella he didn't recognize leaning over the end of his bed. The priest was a bit frightened, naturally enough, but he asked the fellow what he wanted. And the fella said in a deep, husky voice that he wanted to go to confession. The priest said it was an awkward time, and wouldn't it do in the morning? But the fella said that the last time he went to confession, there was one sin he kept back, being ashamed to mention it, and now it was always on his mind. Then the priest knew it was a bad case, because the fella was after making a bad confession and committing a mortal sin. He got up to dress, and just then the cock crew in the yard outside, and lo and behold, when the priest looked round, there was no sign of the fella, only a smell of burning timber. And when the priest looked at his bed, didn't he see the print of 2 hands burned in it? That was because the fella had made a bad confession. This story made a shocking impression on me. But the worst of all was when she showed us how to examine our conscience. Did we take the name of the Lord our God in vain? Did we honor our father and mother? I asked her, did this include grandmothers? And she said it did. Did we love our neighbour as ourselves? Did we covet our neighbour's goods? I thought of the way I felt about the penny that Nora got every Friday. I decided that between one thing and another, I must have broken the whole 10 commandments, all on account of that old woman. And so far as I could see, so long as she remained in the house, I had no hope of ever doing anything else. I was scared to death of confession. The day the whole class went, I let on to have a toothache, hoping my absence wouldn't be noticed. But at 3 o'clock, just as I was feeling safe, along comes a chap with a message from Mrs. Ryan that I was to go to confession myself on Saturday and be at the chapel for communion with the rest. To make it worse, Mother couldn't come with me and sent Nora instead. Now, that girl had ways of tormenting me that Mother never knew of. She held my hand as we went down the hill, smiling sadly and saying how sorry she was for me, as if she were bringing me to the hospital for an operation. "Oh, God, help us," she moaned. "Isn't it a terrible pity you weren't a good boy? Oh, Jackie, my heart bleeds for you. How will you ever think of all your sins? Don't forget, you have to tell him about the time you kicked Gran on the shin." "Let me go," I said, trying to drag myself free of her. "I don't want to go to confession." "But sure, you'll have to go to confession, Jackie," she replied in the same regretful tone. "Sure, if you didn't, the parish priest would be up to the house looking for you. 'Tisn't God knows that I'm not sorry for you. Do you remember the time you tried to kill me with the bread knife under the table? And the language you used to me. I don't know what he'll do with you at all, Jackie. He might have to send you up to the bishop." I remember thinking bitterly that she didn't know the half of what I had to tell her, if I told it. I knew I couldn't tell it, and understood perfectly why the fellow in Mrs. Ryan's story had made a bad confession. It seemed to me a great shame that people wouldn't stop criticizing him. I remember that steep hill down to the church, and the sunlit hillsides beyond the valley of the river, which I saw in the gaps between the houses like Adam's last glimpse of paradise. Then, when she had manoeuvred me down the long flight of steps to the chapel yard, Nora suddenly changed her tone. She became the raging, malicious devil she really was. "There you are," she said with a yelp of triumph, hurling me through the church door. "And I hope he'll give you the penitential psalms, you dirty little caffler." I knew then that I was lost, given up to eternal justice. The door with the coloured glass panels swung shut behind me. The sunlight went out and gave place to deep shadow, and the wind whistled outside so that the silence within seemed to crackle like ice under my feet. Nora sat in front of me by the confession box. There were a couple of old women ahead of her, and then a miserable-looking poor devil came and wedged in at the other side so that I couldn't even escape even if I had the courage. He joined his hands and rolled his eyes in the direction of the roof, muttering aspirations in an anguished tone. And I wondered, had he a grandmother too? Only a grandmother could account for a fella behaving in that heartbroken way. But he was better off than I, for he at least could go and confess his sins, while I would make a bad confession and then die in the night and be continually coming back and burning people's furniture. Nora's turn came, and I heard the sound of something slamming, and then her voice, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. And then another slam, and out she came. God, the hypocrisy of woman! Her eyes were lowered, her head was bowed, and her hands were joined very low down on her stomach. And she walked up the aisle to the side altar, looking like a saint. You never saw such an exhibition of devotion. And I remembered the devilish malice with which she had tormented me all the way from our door. And I wondered, were all religious people like that, really? It was my turn now. With the fear of damnation in my soul, I went in, and the confessional door closed of itself behind me. It was pitch dark, and I couldn't see priest or anything else. Then I was really beginning to get frightened. In the darkness, it was a matter between God and me, and he had all the odds. He knew what my intentions were before I even got started. I had no chance. All I had ever been told about confession got mixed up in my mind. And I knelt to one wall and said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession." I waited for a few minutes, but nothing happened. So I tried it on the other wall. Nothing happened there either. He had me spotted all right. It must have been then that I noticed the shelf at about one height with my head. It was really a place for grown-up people to rest their elbows. But in my distracted state, I thought it was probably the place you were supposed to kneel. Of course, it was on the high side and not very deep, but I was always very good at climbing and managed to get up all right. Staying up was the trouble. There was only room for my knees, and nothing you could get a grip on but a sort of wooden moulding a bit above it. I held onto the moulding and repeated the words a little louder. And this time, something happened all right. A slide was slammed back. A little light entered the box, and a man's voice said, "Who's there?" "'Tis me, Father," I said, for fear he mightn't see me and go away again. I couldn't see him at all. The place the voice came from was under the moulding, about level with my knees. So I took a good grip of the moulding and swung myself down till I saw the astonished face of a young priest looking at me. He had to put his head on one side to see me, and I had to put mine on one side to see him. So we were more or less talking to each other upside down. It struck me as a queer way of hearing confessions, but I didn't feel it my place to criticize. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession." I rattled off all in one breath and swung myself down the least shade more to make it easier for him. "What are you doing up there?" he shouted in an angry voice. And the strain the politeness was putting on my hold of the moulding, and the shock of being addressed in such an uncivil tone, were too much for me. I lost my grip, tumbled, and hit the door an unmerciful wallop before I found myself flat on my back in the middle of the aisle. The people who had been waiting stood up with their mouths open. The young priest opened the door of the middle box and came out, pushing his biretta back from his forehead. He looked something terrible. Then Nora came scampering down the aisle. "Oh, you dirty little caffler," she said. "I might have known you'd do it. I might have known you'd disgrace me. I can't leave you out of my sight for 1 minute." Before I could even get to my feet to defend myself, she bent down and gave me a clip across the ear. This reminded me that I was so stunned I had even forgotten to cry, so that people might think I wasn't hurt at all, when I was in fact probably maimed for life. I gave a roar out of me. "What's all this?" the priest hissed, getting angrier than ever and pushing Nora off me. "How dare you hit the child like that, you little vixen?" "But I can't do my penance with him, Father," Nora cried, cocking an outraged eye up at him. "Well, go and do it, or I'll give you some more to do," he said, giving me a hand up. "Was it coming to confession you were, my poor man?" he asked me. "It was, Father," said I with a sob. "Oh," he said respectfully, "a big hefty fellow like you must have terrible sins. Is this your first?" "'Tis, Father." "Worse and worse," he said gloomily. "The crimes of a lifetime. I don't know, will I get rid of you at all today? You'd better wait now till I'm finished with these owl ones. You can see by the looks of them they haven't much to tell." "I will, Father," I said with something approaching joy. The relief of it was really enormous. Nora stuck out her tongue at me from behind his back, but I couldn't even be bothered retorting. I knew from the very moment that man opened his mouth that he was intelligent above the ordinary. When I had time to think, I saw how right I was. It only stood to reason that a fella confessing after 7 years would have more to tell than people that went every week. The crimes of a lifetime. Exactly as he said. It was only to be what he expected. And the rest was the cackle of old women and girls with their talk of hell, the bishop and the penitential psalms. That was all they knew. I started to make my examination of conscience, and barring the one bad business of my grandmother, it didn't seem so bad. The next time, the priest steered me into the confession box himself and left the shutter back, the way I could see him get in and sit down at the further side of the grill from me. "Well now, what do they call you?" "Jackie, Father." "And what's the trouble to you, Jackie?" "Father, I had it all arranged to kill my grandmother." He seemed a bit shaken by that, all right, because he said nothing. He said nothing for quite a while. My goodness, that'd be a shocking thing to do. What put that into your head? "Father, she's an awful woman." "Is she now? What way is she awful?" "She takes porter, Father," I said, knowing well from the way Mother talked of it that this was a mortal sin, and hoping it would make the priest more favourable in his view of my case. "Oh my! And snuff, Father." "Oh, that's a bad case, sure enough, Jackie." "And she goes around in her bare feet, Father. And she knows I don't like her, and she gives pennies to Nora and none to me, and my dad sides with her and flakes me, and one night I was so heart-scalded I made up my mind I'd have to kill her." "And what would you do with the body?" he asked. He asked with great interest. "I was thinking I could chop that up and carry it away in a barra that I have." "Begor, Jackie, do you know you're a terrible child?" "I know, Father. I tried to kill Nora too with a bread knife under the table, only I missed her." "Is that the little girl that was beating you just now?" "'Tis, Father." "Huh. Someone will go for her with a bread knife one day, and he won't miss her." "You must have great courage. Between ourselves, there's a lot of people I'd like to do the same to, but I'd never have the nerve. Hanging is an awful death." "Is it, Father?" I asked with the deepest interest. I was always very keen on hanging. "Did you ever see a fella hanged?" "Oh, dozens of them," he said solemnly, "and they all died roaring." "Jay!" "Oh, a horrible death. Lots of the fellas I saw killed their grandmothers too. But they all said 'twas never worth it." He had me there for a full 10 minutes talking, and then walked out the chapel yard with me. I was genuinely sorry to part with him, because he was the most entertaining character I'd ever met in the religious line. Outside, after the shadow of the church, the sunlight was like the roaring of waves on a beach. It dazzled me, and when the frozen silence melted and I heard the screech of trams on the road, my heart soared. I knew now I wouldn't die in the night and come back, leaving marks on my poor mother's furniture. It would be a great worry to her, and the poor soul had enough to worry about. Nora was sitting on the railing waiting for me, and she put on a very sour puss when she saw the priest with me. She was mad jealous because a priest had never come out of the church with her. "Well," she asked coldly after he left me, "what did he give you?" "3 Hail Marys," I said. "3 Hail Marys," she repeated incredulously. "You mustn't have told him everything." "I told him everything. About Gran and all." "About Gran and all." All she wanted was to be able to go home and say I'd made a bad confession. "Did you tell him you went for me with a bread knife?" she asked with a frown. "I did, to be sure." "And he only gave you 3 Hail Marys?" "That's all." Then she slowly got down from the railing with a baffled air. Clearly, this was beyond her. As we mounted the steps back to the main road, she looked at me suspiciously. "What are you sucking?" she asked. "Bullseyes." "Bullseyes? Was it the priest gave them to you?" "'Twas." "Lord God," she wailed bitterly, "some people have all the luck. 'Tis no advantage to anybody trying to be good. I might as well just be a sinner like you." The end.
Great story, wonderfully read.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed. So, we all remember our rules, I suppose. Just raise our hand if you have any points to make on the story.
I think I was as surprised to discover that I really liked the priest as the kid was. I just, the description of this kid climbing up on this little shelf and then looking upside down at the priest, it was so well, it's so funny, it's so realistic. I could see it happening. Such
Yeah.
a dumb kid thing to do. I could see it, and then he falls out of the confessional on the floor. I love it.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well,
Betty?
of course, it had its tremendous humor throughout, but it also shows that those who are boxed in by religiosity can be extremely cruel. They go by supposed rules, but there's no spirituality there. This religiosity is not spirituality. That's it.
Paul, thank you. I'm convinced again there will always be an Ireland. So well done.
It struck me that, the priest was very worldly, wasn't he? Just he knew exactly what he was dealing with. This little kid who was doing his first confession. He just handled it, you know.
Yeah.
Too taken aback by the fact that he was about to try and rub out his granny. Yes.
That was wonderful,
Thank you.
but I'm not from a Catholic background. What precisely do you say when you say a Hail Mary?
A Hail Mary is a prayer, and it's it's about 30 seconds to recite it fully, and it's one of the sort of fundamental prayers of Catholicism. I don't know if anybody else can add more, but
Do you know the words to it?
I do. If you'd like to hear it.
Yes.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
And it's a punishment to have to say that.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. What happens in confession, a thumbnail, is that you confess your sins and then sort of resolve vocally to not sin again, which is ironic. And then the priest will give you your penance, and your penance generally consists of a number of prayers. And are you familiar with the rosary? No, probably not. The rosary is the Catholics have sort of compiled various prayers into 10 Hail Marys with an Our Father beginning and another short prayer at the end. Comprises a decade, a decade of the rosary, and I think there are 5, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 decades in a rosary. And so the priest might say, you know, for your penance, say 5 decades of the rosary, or you know, obviously 3 Hail Marys is fairly light, you know, but I actually haven't gone to confession because in my teenage years I began to have issues with the Catholic Church, and so I ceased going in my teens, so I haven't actually ever gone as an adult and confessed any weighty sins, so I'm not sure exactly how heavy one's penance can get, but certainly when you're a child it tends to be on this sort of, it's about, you know, somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes worth of prayer that you then go off and attend to, having exited the confessional.
Stephen.
Well, with apologies to anybody else here, that's about as entertaining a story and reading as I've heard in a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We got to get you back soon. So keep looking for stories.
Carl?
I love the motif of the burnt hands on the furniture.
Yeah.
Because as a kid, you would believe that.
Oh, and be horrified, and tormented, or fascinated,
Or,
you know?
or at some time say, what a great revenge.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
I thought you did a fantastic job. I mean, from start to finish, it was just wonderful. I mean, you read it beautifully. I love the story, and I can also see why there are so many ex-Catholics. But also, you know, it had the, you know, the retribution, redemption, and so, you know, you wanted Nora to get something bad happen to her. So it was very satisfying, you know, what happened, because she deserved to be put down.
Right.
So it was just wonderful. And I was trying to remember, I mean, Frank O'Connor is a very familiar name, but have people read his stories here before?
I did, I read one. It
Oh,
was called Christmas Morning, I think, was the name of it.
oh, because I remembered, you know, thinking, you know, what a great writer he is.
In which he talks about how poor they were and his alcoholic father, and you know, he would go up to the pub and drink and then not give their mother anything for the Christmas gifts or anything.
Yes.
Well, actually, I do believe someone else read that story, First Confession.
Yeah.
But he or she was not
Someone
Irish,
else.
and it was not the same
Oh.
story.
Oh.
I've heard it. I was trying to remember if I'd heard it here or if I'd heard it years ago now, or whether I heard it on yeah, or
Someone read it here because I remember seeing it on the list, but I wasn't present
Right.
when it was read, actually.
yes.
I was wondering whether you're a professional actor.
I am actually.
I
Yes.
thought so. I wonder, all of his stories are in a humorous vein, or does he ever write anything serious?
Well, he's got a lot of stories, so I can't talk to them all. The ones I've read, a lot of them are obliquely humorous, or not obliquely, but directly humorous. But there's one actually that's it struck me very, very profoundly. It's called Guests of the Nation, and it's actually a very, very poignant, sad story with humor in it. And I think that's the Irish way of telling a story. Even if it's ultimately a tragedy, there's always the poignancy of humor in it, and I think that's Irish writers do that. You know, you see that in the plays of like Sean O'Casey, something like Juno and the Paycock, where you're laughing out loud at points of the play and then just devastated at the end of the play. And in parts of it, there's moments of tragedy, but there's this sort of up and down. They definitely know how to pluck at the heartstrings.
Yeah. He does.
For O'Connor. Well, I think Irish. Well, this is Sean O'Casey, who wrote Juno and the Paycock.
Yes.
O'Connor, you know, as a great Irish writer, I think knows how to do that as well. Frank O'Connor knows how to do that as well, to play this sort of the variance of the make it like a melody, fast and slow. I'm not making any sense.
No, I think
No, I'm just
To
thinking,
contrast-
I think he does it better than others.
Yes.
There's a book called, published by Oxford, called Book of Humorous Prose in English, Book of Humorous Prose in English, in the English language. And in that's the one story that he reprints in full. Everything else he reprints in little pieces, you know. And he called.
Guest of the Nation?
He's a British, Muir, I think is his name, who's done a lot of anthologies and stuff. And he says it's the best known short story in the English language.
Which one is that?
This tonight's story?
This story, First
Really?
Confession.
Oh.
Wow.
Wow. Paul, question for you as an Irishman. The Irish and English are working the same language. What is it in the Irish that makes their use of the language, so colorful? I mean, some of those lines are really spectacular.
I completely agree. I read this out to my wife, who's actually from Argentina, and so English is her second language, but she's an actress as well, and she's very literary, and I'm looking to shit. There's one sentence here which, when I was reading it to her, I had to stop and read it again, because even as an Irishman, I was astounded by the way that this sentence is constructed, because I can't find it off. Here it is. I want to read this out to you just as an example. The next time, the priest steered me into the confession box himself and left the shutter back the way I could see him get in and sit down at the further side of the grill from me. The construction there is that there's prepositions and things. So in answer to your question, I think what it is that the Irish went from being Gaelic speaking, Irish speaking, the entire nation, to being English speaking in about a generation. It happened somewhere in about the latter half of the 19th century. Basically, the English came in and said, we're renaming everything here. All the Irish place names are being given English place names. There's a play, Translations, I'm sure you know it, by Brian Friel, and it addresses this.
Yes.
And I think that's part of it, is that they, what happened was they very quickly had to learn this language in order to survive, but they kept a lot of the constructions from Gaelic, because Gaelic is not a Latin language. It doesn't come from a Latin or Roman base, unlike the Romance languages of, arguably English, certainly French, Italian and Spanish, which are all kind of very, very similar. Gaelic has its own very odd constructions, and so they kept some of those constructions and then just began to use them in English, and so they began to they really took it and made it their own, and it's kind of beautiful, because when you think about it, it's the ultimate kind of thumbing their nose at the English for having foisted this language on them. They then took it, tinkered around with it, and tossed it back to them by what courtesy of Joyce, O'Casey and O'Connor, and said, what do you think of that? Take that and spit it in your pipe and smoke it.
No, it has always struck me as exactly the same way. And it's not just the construction, it seems to me also the actual vocabulary as well. I was at sea for a long time. I sailed with a lot of Irish guys, and I remember being on the foredeck of one ship. We just painted the front of the house, and the bosun was a Dubliner, and he says, well, you look at the house there, he says, hasn't it got a brave glitter? Brave glitter? Well, that's great.
Beautiful, yeah.
Brave glitter.
Yeah.
Steve?
Aside from your describing this quality of Irish writers, always injecting humor into any kind of a tale, I'm still impressed that, given his very severe childhood, he's, I don't know what you would call it, a big enough person that he will still write, humorously, and with a great deal of gentleness. Really, he doesn't seem to have been made unbearably bitter by his childhood. He still wanted to create.
Yeah, and still had, arguably happy memories. What struck me was I really only did the research in the biography as means of coming here and being able to talk about Frank O'Connor. So I was stunned to realize, having read this and other short stories, that he was an only child. He didn't have a sister. I mean, I would have sworn this was a biographical story. It's just so colourful, isn't it? Like, I saw it so vividly in my mind the first time I heard it or read it, and rereading it, I'm like, this must have happened.
Yeah.
It's just too real. But Nora never existed. It's a figment of his very powerful imagination.
He
Francis.
was extraordinarily bright, wasn't he? I seem to remember reading some autobiographical materials about him too, and I was reading the stories I read by him. And I think he knew, was it Greek or something at a very young age? He taught himself Greek or learned Greek.
Really?
I mean, when he was still very young. Yeah, he must have had, great intellect.
Yeah. Well, he lectured at Harvard and Stanford.
Yeah,
So,
and he is really considered one of the foremost short story writers
Yeah.
ever.
yeah.
Do you know enough about the stories or the other things that he wrote that were banned to know if they were because they were about religion?
I don't know, but I can tell you in those days it didn't take much to get banned in Ireland.
Uh-huh.
In the 40s and 50s, or even really up until the last 10, 15 years. Ulysses was banned when it first came out, and many other things. I have a list here I can show you at the end that tells you pretty much everything that got banned. It doesn't tell you why, but I'm sure it didn't take much.
Back to Steve's question about, a difficult childhood and how is it possible for him to write a funny story? Frank McCourt touches on that in his book, Angela's Ashes, and he said all we had was humor.
Yeah.
Yeah, growing up not too far from Glasgow, the same thing. These are ragged-assed kids, snotty nosed. They had a huge energy and a lot of humor. And you're right. I mean, that was one of the things that just sustained them. It's a pretty grim surroundings.
Yeah.
They just slugged their way through it. And, I didn't really feel that Nora was due or come up. In fact, it was just kids sprawling around, and the priest taking a sort of an adult view of all of that. Saying that getting her with somebody's going to get her with a bread knife one of these days.
But the O'Connor is really a sketch, though. His sister didn't just push him through the church door; she hurled him through the church door.
But I wonder, I don't think the Irish can really lay claim to the sort of the humour in the face of ill odds, because I think, I've experienced it even here in New York City. You just have to find people who are having a tough time. Not all of them, but by and large, they've got humour to keep them going, because a lot of it, sometimes if you don't laugh, you'll cry, and it's just kind of hang on to it, and you just got to keep yourself juiced up to keep going. I think there's a lot of that here just in this city.
The big humor kind of break was when he said, "What are you going to do with the body?"
Yeah.
And yet it wasn't humor. It was what how to handle the situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it was just brilliant.
Yeah. He got into the world of the kid.
What understanding is beyond. It's a very empathetic.
One of the things I love about this story, you touched a little bit about this sort of piety of people, and I like its empty piety. And what I like, one of the things I like about this story is that it sort of pokes a bit of fun at the empty piety, and it also, there's a lot you can. The Catholic Church is an institution that's easy to poke holes in, and I think it's nice in this story that actually the priest is a pretty good guy.
Yes.
He could very easily have been a lot of things that are unsavory, and goodness knows in the last 10 or 15 years there's a lot of unsavory things have come out about priests, and how nice to have a priest, like a character here who's one of the good guys. He's not necessarily his heart's in the right place. I think that was kind of heartwarming.
Well, I was just going to say, that's what I think is so charming about the story. It's so unusual. I mean, we're used to hearing these stories about, the priest as sort of an icon,
Right.
and more like the grandmother. So and that's what's so refreshing about this guy.
I never thought about that. It's
And
like
that's why I said it was as surprising to me to hear about this priest who's really pretty okay human guy. And then, I sort of got the figure, he's probably bored to death with hearing these confessions. And here's some refreshing, it probably reminds him of himself when he was that age, How delightful.
I never thought about the juxtaposition of normally we think of grandmothers as being, you know, they're just untouchable in terms of their almost holiness, but certainly their lovingness. But here, from the get-go, it's like the granny is a witch, you know. And here, yeah, you know, and instead of the priest being the whitened sepulchre, he's actually a good guy, you know.
Well, Paul, thanks again. That was a great story.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. I'd love to.
And I
And
would, I would like
over
to,
to Stephen now as our Uber host.
I would like to thank Neil for being host for February, and just a fantastic month, really. Absolutely one of the best we've had. And I was thanking Neil for being host this month. And Pat Taylor is going to be host for March. And our reader next week is someone you're not familiar with at all, Neil Osborne, who will be reading The Mission by Bruce J. Friedman. And Pat sent me this list. Let me tell you about the other ones. The following week, Judy Chang is going to read Ministers of Grace by Saki, H.H. Monroe. And then Carol Emmerling is going to read a couple of stories. And then Allison Wills is going to read The Last Rung on the Ladder by Stephen King. And we're going to wind up the month. David Robb is going to be reading excerpts from Judevine by David Budhill. Actually, Pat, I believe, has started her Vietnam trip by now. So she's not going to be here next Wednesday, and she's asked me to host, and we hope you'll all show up. And thank you again, Paul. It's,
Thank you.
Very good. Nice to capture that on TV.
you know, Carlton, that's a really good idea that you had. And I wonder if we couldn't really expand it.
They read a point.
Whether or not it actually happens, but if we could say, we're offering these to shut into DVD player.
I wish I could take time to the real art of it, which is the writing. But I can't. But it's a beautifully structured story. I know that there's satisfaction in what happens to Norm. It's not so hard. He gets beaten by a dog. He just kind of gets put in her place. Yeah. And the arc of the story is what it's just so structured.
I've never heard this one before.
It's when I see a source like this, and it just seems so effortless. We all feel like we never try, and it's like, you know.
That's good. So see you tomorrow night? Yeah. See you tomorrow night? We may have some snow.